Welcome to Energy in Cells. Our next two units will be on photosynthesis and then on cellular respiration, but first we're going to take a look at energy and what cells use for energy. To do that, we're going to discuss the terms autotroph and heterotroph again. As you know, autotrophs are organisms that can make their own food. They are able to extract carbon from inorganic molecules. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, are consumers, and they need to consume other organisms to get food, and they need to get organic compounds from other organisms. And they do that by eating or by decomposing something. So on this image, on the left, you can see an autotroph and a heterotroph. This algae over here, which has seriously overgrown on a Chinese beach, this algae is a producer or an autotroph, which are the two similar terms. And this organism here, the human, is a classic heterotroph who needs to consume other organisms for food. And hopefully those other organisms don't include this algae, but other more palatable things. On the right-hand side, you also have an autotroph-heterotroph pair. So the orange came from an orange tree, making it an autotroph. And then this over here, this mold that has attacked the orange, is actually a heterotroph. Molds are fungi. They are decomposers. They get their energy from the organisms they decompose, and they do not make their own food. Here are more autotroph-heterotroph pairs. So these tomatoes here are making organic molecules by using energy from the sun, and those organic molecules include glucose. The goat on the right-hand side is a heterotroph because it can't make its own glucose. It gets its glucose by consuming the tomato plant. Now we're going to tie this back to the carbon cycle, which we learned about a couple units ago. So we know that carbon is a very essential, important element that we need inside of our cells. And we also know that there's carbon dioxide in the air. However, the carbon in carbon dioxide is not really in a useful form for us humans, for us heterotrophs. So we need some other organism to take the carbon out of that carbon dioxide and convert it into a more useful form. And the organisms that do that for us are the producers. Plants, for example. And plants can take carbon dioxide and through the process of photosynthesis, change the carbon into glucose. And that glucose is in a useful form that we can get when we feed on plants or when we feed on organisms that fed on plants. And that's the way we get those organic molecules. So in the next two chapters I mentioned earlier, we're going to look at photosynthesis, which takes place in a chloroplast, and we're going to take a look at cellular respiration, which takes place inside of the mitochondria and helps to extract energy from our food. And those two chapters we're going to take a much more detailed look at. Before we do that, I want to show you the two equations that will frame our next two units. So photosynthesis, which is on the top, involves what autotrophs do for us. And photosynthesis begins with carbon dioxide and water, which are the two things that plants need, and it's powered by light energy from the sun. And through this process, plants are able to rearrange the carbon dioxide and water molecules into sugar or glucose, and they also produce oxygen as a byproduct. So this is when we say plants make their own food, they make glucose. On the bottom, we see cellular respiration, and really the point of cellular respiration is to extract energy from food and use that energy to then be able to do work. So if you are closely looking at the two reactions, you can see that the products of photosynthesis end up being the reactants of cellular respiration. So we begin with sugar and oxygen helps us break apart the sugar and release the energy that's inside of it. During this process, we also form carbon dioxide as a byproduct, which we breathe out, and water is also a byproduct in this process. Okay, so let's look at energy. From our discussion of thermodynamics, we know that energy can be transformed from one form to another, but it cannot be created or destroyed. This we know from the first law of thermodynamics. We know energy comes in many forms like light, heat, electrical, mechanical, chemical energy. And in this particular unit, we'll take a close look at the energy that's stored inside of chemical bonds, inside of things like glucose. And that energy those chemical bonds can be broken to release that energy so that the energy can be used to do work. In our cells, we use something known as ATP for energy. And ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. Tri meaning three. we have 3 phosphate groups. So if you look at our little diagram of ATP, there are 3 phosphate groups. 1, 2, 3. Between these phosphate groups are bonds. Here's one chemical bond, and here's another one, which store a lot of energy. ATP also has this purple thing, which is a 5-carbon sugar called ribose. And ATP also has a nitrogenous base, which is here in green. And ATP is formed when our food molecules like glucose are broken down, and it is the energy currency of our cell. It's what our cells run on. The second molecule we're going to look at is ADP. And ADP is what forms when we take off one of those phosphate groups from our ATP. So adenosine diphosphate, di meaning 2, has only 2 phosphate groups because one of them was broken off to release energy. So this is ADP. As it turns out, our bodies go between ATP and ADP all the time. ATP is constantly being used and remade by cells. In fact, cells only have enough ATP to last for a few seconds. ATP is really good at transferring energy. It's not good for long-term energy storage. So what happens here is we have ATP, which has a lot of energy in it, and we can break off one of these bonds, one of these phosphate groups off of ATP, and in so doing, we release energy that can be used to do work, and then we end up having ADP. And then ADP can then be phosphorylated, which means we add another phosphate group back on, and once again, we'll end up with ATP. You want to think of this in terms of a battery. ADP is like a partially charged battery. ATP is like a fully charged battery that's ready to go and do work. So we take ATP, we break off a phosphate group, we do some work, we end up with a partially charged battery known as ADP, and we need to charge it again by adding on a phosphate group. So we are constantly going between the two inside of our cells. So what's the point of this ATP rather? What is the work that our cells actually do? For example, cells can do active transport. In this case, you see an amoeba, which is trying to eat this poor little paramecium, and it looks like it's going to succeed. And this process is going to require ATP. The movement of our cells requires ATP. So our muscle cells, for example, moving our skeleton, that requires ATP. Our nerve cells sending messages, that requires ATP. Photosynthesis, respiration, protein synthesis, all these chemical reactions inside of our bodies, inside of plants, they require ATP. So in this next slide, you're going to see one example of something that happens in our bodies that requires ATP. So this big cell over here is actually a white blood cell, and those round cells around it are red blood cells. And you can see the white blood cells in our bloodstream, and it's chasing that little black object. That's bacteria. Our cells have recognized the bacteria as being foreign, and they're going to hunt it down and try to keep us safe and keep our immune system healthy. So there you go. The bacteria has been swallowed. It's been taken in by the white blood cell, and we're now going to be kept safe from getting sick. So that requires ATP. So how do animals end up with ATP? We know that carbon-based molecules in food store chemical energy inside of their bonds. And from the previous chapter we learned about digestion, we know that foods are ingested, they're taken in, and then they're digested into smaller and smaller molecules until we end up with the monomers of our different macromolecules. And basically, those foods, when they're broken apart, can help create ATP, can help make ATP. And different types of foods can actually make different amounts of ATP. So for example, what we most commonly use to make ATP involves carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are most commonly used for energy inside of our cells. And glucose is one example of a carbohydrate. Glucose is a simple sugar. It's a monosaccharide. Here's the chemical formula for glucose, C6H12O6, which is something you'll have to learn. And glucose can make 36 to 38 ATP for your cells. Proteins can also be used to make ATP, and they make about the same amount of ATP as carbohydrates, but we typically don't use proteins for ATP. We use proteins for other things, but not to make ATP. And then lipids can actually store a huge amount of energy. For example, triglyceride can make almost 400 ATP. Here's a little table showing you how many calories each type of macromolecule can produce per milligram. And you can see carbohydrates and proteins are 4 calories per milligram, and then lipids are a lot more. They're 9 calories per milligram. So that's where we get our ATP from. What about plants? How do plants get ATP? And plants actually make their own sugar, and then they break apart that sugar. And they break apart that sugar to make ATP. So that is basically an introduction to cells and energy, and I really hope that was helpful.